Implementing ITIL, Module number 7, Transforming the Organization. In this module, we will focus on practices and techniques for moving your designed ITIL solutions into a production state. We will discuss ITSM transition concepts, walk through a step-by-step process for building the IT service management organization, learn some approaches for how to embed processes into the organization, and lastly, we'll cover some basics around IT service management metrics. So here's where we are at so far. In Learning Module number 1, we covered our entire ITIL implementation lifecycle at a high level. Learning Module 2, we discussed the ITSM visioning step, understanding how we could set objectives, the business vision, establishing our ITIL program charter, organizational change, and a number of other topics. Learning Module number 3, we talked about ITSM assessments, learning how to assess our processes, technologies, organization, and governance and reporting practices. In Learning Module number 4, we learned how to translate the outputs of those assessments into initial wins, recommendations, and action items. We also learned how to plan our ITSM project and our efforts, and also a little bit about what's involved with putting an implementation win program and effort into place. In Learning Module number 5, we talked through how to design your ITIL processes and presented a 10-step approach for how you might design an ITIL process from the beginning to the end. In Module number 6, we finished off that design effort with some examples and techniques and experiences from many different companies that have already been working with ITIL to give you a heads up in terms of some of the issues that you may face and what you might do about those as you go forward. And now here we are in Learning Module number 7, where we'll focus on some good practices and techniques for moving our ITIL solutions into production. Here's what we'll cover in this learning module. Lesson 1, IT Service Management Transition, a deeper dive. We'll cover more details around some of the techniques and steps and considerations and concepts around transition. In Lesson 2, we'll cover a step-by-step approach for building the IT Service Management organization. In Lesson 3, we'll cover some concepts and techniques about embedding processes into your IT organization. And in Lesson 4, we'll talk about ITSM metrics, how you can validate the results of your implementation effort, as well as start to report on your processes as you go forward. Lesson 1, ITSM Transition, a deeper dive. In this lesson, we will cover a variety of good practices and techniques that can be considered and used as you move your ITIL process solutions into production. Here's a look at our IT Service Management Transition work stage and all its activities. It is in this stage that we will deploy both initial win and process solutions simultaneously. Here you will be implementing your ITIL processes, technologies, organization, and governance solutions along with your initial win efforts. Remember that we are not just transitioning a process by itself or a hardware tool, a piece of hardware or a software tool or management tool by itself. We are going to be releasing these things together, considering process, technology, organization, and governance. The key tasks within this work stage include, number 1, managing this work stage as a project. Number 2, coordinating initial win rollout activities as we move forward. Coordinating communications and training, service reporting, organization, governance controls. There's all the pillars for our solution as we go forward. And then at the end of this effort, leftover gaps and further improvement recommendations will be noted. These will then be addressed as we start to go back through our implementation life cycle, going back to the visioning stage. These particular gaps that we see as we went through the transition will then be considered in terms of our next vision for our next wave of improvements as we move forward. Here is the overall approach that is recommended for building each ITIL process. The yellow squares indicate key tasks that were done as part of the IT Service Management Design work stage. The purple squares represent tasks that will now be done in the IT Service Management Transition work stage. The red circles represent key milestones in the overall design and transition efforts. These can be used to track your progress as you proceed. You'll notice in the Overcome Identified Gaps box, that's the one near milestone number 4, and it is the only box that is double shaded both yellow and purple. In this box, and at this point in time in our effort, the process solutions were designed and built. A transition plan was also developed. The bulk of the work in the transition work stage is really spent beyond that point executing that transition plan. Here is a typical deployment roadmap. We start with the transition plan, make sure we have needed stakeholder commitment, start a communications and training program with our affected stakeholders, deploy a pilot, and then roll out solutions to the remaining stakeholders over some period of time. The questions below each box represent key criteria that needs to be answered before we move on to the next step. Again, as you go through this, think of the ITIL release management lifecycle that was presented in ITIL version 2. We are basically using the same approach to bootstrap our efforts into production, moving from planning to building to testing to communicating and eventually to rollout. Let's talk a little bit about conducting IT service management pilots. Pilots are highly recommended for deploying your solutions. These give you a chance to test your solutions in a live yet limited environment. When you do a pilot, again, be very careful, especially if you're working with other stakeholders outside of your project team, to make sure that expectations are strongly set ahead of time. A pilot that yields poor results or is incomplete or that does not go well may foster a reputation that the entire implementation effort is failing or no good. These people will then go back to the respective units and may start to communicate those kinds of messages, which will make resistance even more of a challenge as you try to keep moving forward. Participants in a pilot need to be reminded over and over that they are really the pioneers in this effort and to expect that not everything may work correctly. Many faults may still be discovered as they go through the pilot effort. The above questions presented on this chart are a good checklist for establishing pilot deployments. What is the purpose of the pilot? What are the desired results you expect to get out of the pilot? What does a successful pilot look like? Very key question. What is success here? What criteria must be met in designing your pilot? What should be considered when you select a candidate to be a pilot? In other words, who should be the recipient of the pilot? How many pilots should you conduct? Is it just one or should it be many? How do we measure success? And then what are the lessons learned in terms of fixing any errors or issues or problems that we see that may have occurred during the pilot? When you run a pilot, it is recommended that the pilot period really not exceed more than 2 to 3 months, if at all possible. This ensures that the pilot stays very contained in terms of its scope and time, and it either does work or it doesn't work, and past that point, you can certainly show progress by starting to deploy to the rest of the organization very quickly, especially if the pilot turned out to be very successful. Again, as you deploy your solutions, the release management process can be used to bundle efforts across all the teams into release packages. This minimizes the effort and the amount of disruptions that might occur when deploying new processes and your initial win solutions. Another benefit, again, is that this allows you to practice some elements of the release management process and prove its benefits. That's why I use the term bootstrapping. You're using ITIL to implement ITIL. What a great concept. As said before, in an example, we may package things together. One example of this might be we might decide to release a service catalog, a capacity plan, maybe a change advisory board policy, and maybe some service level agreements with 2 business organizations. And we take all those items and disassemble them into a specific release. Another example of a release is maybe we combine a change management where maybe we call it version 1.2 that is now released with some basic process activities in place that just simply do simple change logging and reporting. As we release a version 2 of change management, we may have added more to that package, such as maybe a change advisory board or CAB review and some processes and procedures around impact analysis. So again, you package these releases, if you will, for deployment in whatever manner logically makes sense given what you're trying to do. A release package for an ITIL implementation can consist of any combination of initial wins and processes or pieces and parts of those. For example, a release may consist of minor changes to a new incident process that was deployed earlier. It may be an implementation of a new problem management tool, process reports, maybe a new capacity management process, maybe a training package for an upcoming release of a change management process. If you look at the example of the kinds of things that could go into a package, we're looking at things such as processes or parts of processes, maybe forms, reports, or outputs from processes. Different technology, there may be tool deployments going on, and we'll also include those within our release. From an organization aspect, we may have assigned resources now, or maybe it's job roles, training, maybe there's new reporting structures that are going into place. And from a governance standpoint, we may be releasing metrics that we are now going to start reporting on. Maybe it's actual service or process reports, policies, and or controls. Again, ITIL does not have any rules about what you put into a release package. This will be up to you based on what you're implementing and the size and scope of your deployment. So here's an example of a potential release package. This one is around change management. If we look under process, we're releasing right now a change management process or some form of that. We're including a new request for change form or RFC form. We now have a standard CAB agenda, so we're going to include that as part of our rollout, and a change management process guide, which will communicate how the change management process works. From a technology standpoint, at the same time, we are also releasing change management tool, or maybe it's a new version of a tool that you already had, but either way a tool would be part of this release. On the organization side, we're going to include and roll out some change management training, and we're also going to roll out our CAB by having assigned CAB members and having trained them on their responsibilities. On the governance side, we may include a change management reporting package and an escalation policy. So all the items shown on this slide could be packaged together into a single release for our change management solution, just as an example. It is recommended that your release packages, when you do these, be initially segregated by each ITIL process area for clarity. The elements of an example release package could be done as shown above. Again, this is an example of a change management one. You might have something similar for other ITIL processes. If multiple process areas are to be coordinated and deployed together, their corresponding release packages can be created separately and then combined into a single release that is deployed all together. Here is an example of just such an approach. In this example, separate packages have been built for change, configuration, and service level management process solutions. The transition plan calls for all three of these to be released together in one single deployment. Each process area being deployed has been established initially as a separate release package. We then combine these separate release packages into a single release. Once we've identified what our releases will look like, releases should be scheduled throughout the deployment effort. The example shown in this particular slide shows a Gantt chart approach where we've listed the different releases that we plan to deploy and the time periods that we expect those to be deployed through. Scheduling and coordination of releases should be coordinated through the IT Service Management Program Office. Again, this was one of the prime reasons for having a program office involved with our deployment efforts. Your deployment, or now transition plans, should identify all the planned releases and their time frame targets when you develop it. This will be a very key area watched closely by the program office and your program sponsors. As you go through the implementation effort and the transition effort, this will be monitored and modified as needed over time as your transition activities take place. The other element of designing your releases is also designing the scope for each release. The scope of releases can vary by the transition strategy selected for each process area. Processes can be deployed all at once. You may decide to only deploy them to certain geographic regions. You may decide the scope only includes certain process activities, but not all process activities. Maybe you can only deploy your process to certain business units. Maybe it's only certain IT departments, or maybe you're deciding that you want to do this in a pilot manner and you selected some pilots to start with first. Again, there are no rules around this, but as you deploy, consider the scope that you're deploying to and work with that as you develop your different packages. Chances are that you may have a number of initial wins and process solutions that need to be deployed. A disaster would occur if each implementation team deployed their assigned solutions separately. You may have lots of cases where people end up with conflicts, things going out ahead of time when they shouldn't have, or maybe just simply inundating your stakeholders with too much change all at once. Therefore, it's highly recommended that some form of transition approach be employed to effectively package and roll out your solutions. These approaches are highlighted on this slide. They may look similar to what you saw in your ITIL Foundation training class. Big bang versus phase, push versus pull, automated versus manual, parallel, and phased parallel. We've added some additional considerations here based on some real-life implementation experiences and situations. Again, there's no right answer for which approach you use. There are only pros and cons, which we'll now take a look at in more detail. Let's take a look at the Big Bang transition strategy, sometimes called the direct approach. This is the easiest and the cheapest way to implement your ITIL solutions. The downside to this, though, is that the approach also carries the highest risk. Once you transition, there is no fallback. This approach, however, may make perfectly good sense if you're a small IT organization or a small business where the risks tend to be lower. In this strategy, you basically have all your solutions and release packages that are sitting in test, and you simply move them over to production all at once as a single unit. Again, the pros or the positives are this is fast, it's cheap. The cons to consider is there's no fallback and it carries the most risk, and it's probably best for small IT service management efforts. So let's take a look at an example of a Big Bang approach. On Friday, we operate with the old incident management process, whatever is current state what we're using today. Using the Big Bang approach, we're going to move everything in all at once so that when we come up on Monday morning, we will now operate with the new incident management process and everything that goes with it. Again, this is just a very straightforward, simple approach, and it works fairly simply. Remember, however, that it carries the most risk because there is no fallback if it turns out that the new incident management process does not work correctly when you start it on Monday morning. Let's take a look at the phase transition strategy. In the phase transition strategy, we are going to move only pieces and parts of our solution, one bit at a time, into production. We will then run it in parallel. We are then going to run it together for a period of time, and then as the solution starts to appear that it's working and running, we then move everything in piece by piece. The pros of this approach are that it's less risky, it's reasonably fast, What's against this particular approach is that it does take longer because now we're moving things in pieces and parts rather than all at once. And there is a risk that since we're moving things in pieces and parts, in order to get the entire solution working with the old solution, we may have to develop some throwaway solutions temporarily just to keep things working until the entire solution is put into place. The phased approach is a good choice for larger efforts where results need to be shown quickly. Essentially, this is a bit like that Big Bang approach, except our Big Bangs are really coming in small little pieces and parts. And again, the con to this approach is that the phasing will take more time. When we use this particular approach, the release scoping mechanism that you use will become very critical in terms of how you decide what those pieces and parts are. Again, you've seen this slide before, but these could become ways that you decide to roll out in phases. Again, that phase could be geographic regions. So I roll things out to one geographic region, and then I'm going to roll it eventually out to other ones. It could be by specific process activities. Maybe I roll out change management, logging and reporting first, and then I'll roll out the CAB and the impact analysis second. Or it could be by business unit. We'll roll out to one business unit and then eventually more business units. Same with IT departments. Or maybe we've decided we're going to do a pilot first and then roll out to the rest of the organization beyond that. So here's an example of use of the phase transition strategy. On Friday, we operate with the old incident management process. On Monday, we're going to implement only incident classification and incident policies, even though we're still operating with the old incident management process and tools. 2 weeks later, we will implement the new incident management tool in a production mode with updated policies and ongoing training to replace the old incident management process workflow. So here we've drawn out our incident management deployment by implementing it in pieces and parts. Here's the parallel transition strategy. The parallel approach provides much less risk than the other two approaches. With this approach, we are going to operate two complete solutions in parallel. The major benefit of doing this is purely that of low risk and safety. There are obviously many cons with this approach in terms of it's expensive. We may have to perform activities twice, do it in the old system and also do it in the new system. And we also have to maintain two redundant solutions separately in multiple places. Where you would use this kind of a solution is typically for something that is very highly critical in nature, where agreement to the costs and the redundancy are accepted and in place. So let's look at our transition strategy for parallel in terms of an example. On Friday, we're going to operate with the old capacity management process. On Monday, we implement the new capacity management process. We still keep the old capacity management process in place, and we're going to run capacity management twice, both ways, the new one with the old one. The reason for doing this is we're going to compare the capacity forecast reports that we get out of the new system with the capacity forecast reports that we get out of the old system. We're going to compare those to make sure that that the new one is as accurate as the old one used to be. Once we feel confident that the capacity forecasts for the new process are accurate, we will shut down the old forecasting process and remove the old capacity management process, therefore operating with one. So again, you can see that this takes longer to do. It looks like it's a little bit of a painful thing to execute because we have to do things twice. But however, we're doing this because we feel that the risks of having a bad capacity forecast outweigh the efforts that it takes to run both ways in parallel. Here's yet another variation on the parallel transition strategy. This one we've called the phased parallel cutover. This one combines both the parallel and the phased approaches together. The phased parallel approach represents the ultimate in safety and lowest risk. It also represents the highest cost and the longest time to deploy. This approach should only be selected if the need for sustaining high levels of service and quality throughout the transition period are absolutely critical. So as you're transitioning a new process into place or service into place, you might select this because the risks of if that service is disrupted or that process doesn't work are so severe that possibly the company might suffer a loss of reputation, major loss of business, or even go out of business. That kind of a risk should be assessed, and then if it's at that level, then this approach may really make sense. Again, it's the ultimate in safety. However, it takes the longest to do. It's also the most expensive. And again, that concept of throwaway solutions, the need for those may be fairly high as you need to work across both ways as you do this. So let's look at the phased parallel transition strategy in terms of an example. On Friday, we operate with that old capacity management process. On Monday, we implement only the data collection piece for the new capacity management process, and we're going to run it in parallel with the old one. So by Monday morning, I'm now still running with my original old process in its entirety, but I'm replicating the efforts involved with doing data collection. Once we feel confident and data collection is working, we shut down the old data collection process that's in the old way of doing things, and then we implement the new capacity modeling process and run it in parallel with the old one. When results for the new modeling process match the old one and we feel comfortable with that, we'll then drop the old one. And we'll keep doing this for each bit and piece and part that we're transitioning into this new process until the entire solution is put into place. Note that because we're dividing things and cutting things apart into pieces and processes, a lot of interface solutions, temporary tooling solutions, temporary data stores will most likely be needed so that data can be read by both the old and the new processes. And then after we've built all of that, those items will then be thrown away once the new process is fully in a production mode. We don't need the old one anymore. So again, this kind of shows the complexity involved with this and why this takes so long and why this is a very expensive approach. Again, you're only going to utilize this kind of approach if it's has very severe consequences to the business if that cutover were not to work for any reason. The last concept to consider when you're doing transition is how you're going to govern changes in scope to your solutions during implementation. An approach for doing this in detail is presented in Implementing ITIL book under the, actually in what they have is the Control Work Stage chapter. Requests for scope changes come into the process, they go through a review board and are either accepted or rejected by the committee. The purpose of having an approach like this in advance and as part of your implementation effort is that political pressure will now be removed from the team members so they can focus on implementation activities. The review committee should have a senior executive doing decision making and representing different business units to make this work. Again, we presented this earlier on in another learning module, but again, the four pieces to this include the governance, exception and appeals, vitality, and communications process. During the governance, we're looking at our scope and maintaining scope as we go throughout the implementation effort. Under exception and appeals, we're accepting requests for change, if you will, for our scoping and how we've scoped the implementation effort to occur. We then run through a vitality process to assess whether that makes sense in terms of what we're doing. We also, in the vitality process, may look at anything in the industry that may have changed from a tooling or process approach or technology that maybe we should consider adopting, even that we didn't consider the first time we did this. And then lastly, communicating any changes out to the rest of the stakeholders and project team members. The reason for having this, again, is so that changes will happen as you go through your implementation effort. And as we said in the previous learning module, you want to have a very well-defined means for capturing those requests when they happen. and letting your stakeholders know that you take each one of these seriously and have a procedure and a process for how they're going to either be accepted or rejected when they go forward. Lesson 2, building the IT service management organization. Let's now take a look at organizational concerns with deploying and operating your ITIL solutions. We need to define both what the organization structure should be for executing IT service management transition workstage activities, and again, that will come from the examples we presented in earlier learning modules for how to organize around your deployment, as well as your transition plan that you're developing. But we also need to design and build the organization structure that will be left in place to operate your ITIL solutions day to day once they put into production. With this latter approach, the organizational structure that you decide to employ for production can run the gamut from simple responsibilities added to your organization to new sets of roles and reporting structures, maybe even new staff put into place to operate the new solutions. This lesson will walk through a step-by-step structured approach for how you can build your end-state IT service management organization. But first, let's take a look at some basic organization concepts. We've seen this chart before in earlier learning modules. Again, this is just one example of a possible organization structure for your deployment tasks for a large company. Again, if you're a smaller company, you may wish to combine some of these roles shown above. Notice again, all the items are represented here for transition work. Process track, technology track, organization track, and a governance track. Also, our core team, extended team, and advisor team are also in place on this chart in terms of the team participation roles that we'll be using as we execute our transaction activities. Note that there's another box called coalition team at the bottom. Coalition teams play an important role during your deployment effort, and this is where those teams truly come into play. Coalition teams may be necessary if you are a very large organization where there are operational points of presence in many areas. For example, you may have multiple data centers or operational sites. All of them are stakeholders in the ITIL solutions that are being deployed. So let's look more closely at the concept of a coalition team. Keep in mind that this is used for a very large deployment in a very large company with points of presence in many places. In one example, we have a data center, actually not a data center, but we have a company that has 96 data centers, and we need to roll change management or new change management practices out to all 96 data centers. How do we get them all to use the same change management process without that project taking years and years to get rolled out? The coalition team is an efficient approach that you can use to make that happen. Representatives from each local center report into the leader role. In this example, there's a representative from each of the global regions that the company exists in. And here you see Americas, Europe, and Asia. Reporting to the representative are local center representatives. These representatives act like extended team members, if you remember that concept from learning module number 3. They represent the interests from the centers that they represent, plus they're also responsible to communicate, train, and make sure that the new process solutions are appropriately embedded into the centers that they belong or are part of. So again, the concept of a coalition team is to spread out and divide the effort, similar to software distribution if you're familiar with that, but in a manner a little bit like dominoes, where I have one leader who then talks to sub-leaders, and those sub-leaders then talk to individuals within their own domain apiece. And we are rolling out the new solutions across the coalition teams to efficiently get new processes and new solutions quickly embedded into many, many different points of presence. Again, by using coalition teams, you can fan out your solutions simultaneously to a large number of locations. Each representative may represent one or more local centers, They have dual responsibilities. Make sure that the local center interests are addressed throughout the deployment, and make sure deployment goals for local centers are achieved. So here in the coalition team, each representative has accountability for the deployment of their planned EIDL solutions within the domain that they represent. The development of necessary management systems required for deployment will also be part of their responsibility. What needs to be input and installed within each of those local centers. Coordination of deployment activities across business units and organizations. Responsibility for the project plan management and attainment of key milestones from a local perspective, again from the areas that they represent. Development and deployment of communications and education to each employee at the local sites they represent. So if I have to train everybody on how to do the new change management process, it will be the coalition team representative that will have the accountability and responsibility to do the new change management training and to make sure that that happens for people at the sites they represent. And then lastly, they are the key interface for coordinating all the deployment activities that they do at their local center with other coalition representatives as needed. Here are typical implementation team roles for deployment efforts. The Implementing EIDL book provides a lot of detailed information, as well as the Architecting EIDL book does as well, that identifies the key roles needed to implement your EIDL solutions and what their key activities typically are. Again, if you're in a small IT organization, you may be wondering, what does this mean? Look at all the names and roles that are out there. Does this mean we have to hire tons and tons of people? And the answer again is, if you are in a small EIDL effort, you can collapse and combine many of these roles into a much smaller number of individuals. Now let's take a look at several basic organizational models that could underpin your eventual organizational solution. Here is what is called a centralized organizational model. In this approach, everything reports up through a highly hierarchical structure. Centralized models are highly efficient at executing developed EIDL solutions. However, they can become bottlenecks as the organization becomes large, highly distributed, or the pace of the business and IT change increases. So with the centralized approach, most of the decision points will exist at the upper levels of the hierarchy, with the lower levels only empowered to carry out those decisions. So decision making basically comes from the top down, not the other way. If we look at an example, an EIDL example of this, let's say we are trying to implement a new change advisory board structure, or CAB. If I'm in a small IT organization, this kind of an approach might work very well. In other words, it may have one CAB that works across the entire organization. In a large organization, and I could think of one, for example, where we literally saw over 20 to 30,000 IT people that worked in that organization, having one CAB just will not work. It will quickly become a very big bottleneck. So that's an example where the centralized approach may not make sense. So again, the pros for this is it's great for small companies. You don't need management at local sites. It's very efficient when making decisions and very much provides a high-level degree of control and low cost. The downside to this is to be careful that the centralized decision-making point at the top doesn't become a bottleneck. And it may also culturally stifle new ways of thinking. Because remember, the people at the bottom of this hierarchy typically carry out orders, but they don't necessarily make decisions. Here's another model called the distributed organizational model. In this one, major process policies and controls would be established centrally at the high levels in the hierarchy. So the policy side of our processes would be determined up at the top. But minor decisions on how those processes are executed can be made at lower levels as long as they don't violate the goals or principles that have been established centrally. So with the distributed model, decision points are done centrally with autonomy for some decisions at the local levels. For this reason, this approach is highly preferred if you're in a much larger organization, especially if you have many locations. In our CAB example, we may decide that rather than having one CAB like in the previous model, the centralized model, we may decide that we want to have a main cab and then have sub-cabs that initially get the changes to be reviewed and then filter based on certain criteria what goes up to a higher level cab. This may be an appropriate model if you're in a very large IT organization where a lot of changes could be determined at the local level very efficiently. However, given certain criteria, it's determined that other groups and other levels of cabs need to look at those changes before they get scheduled and go forward. So the positive side to this is it's a good model for if you're a global or a very large company. The management of your IT service management solutions is really much closer to those that execute them, since they now have some decision-making authority. Still gives you a high degree of control since the policy-making decisions and controls are set at the top. And it allows for quick adaptation to local business needs, even though you're a large company. Again, the downside of this is you have to consider that I have to have enterprise standards and controls that are very strong. Otherwise, I lose control of what's going on. If I decide to do this in terms of, let's say, a change management solution, and I don't have very strong policies at the top, I'm essentially allowing each subgroup to implement change management in a way that they see fit, and I might start to lose control. The workgroup approach can be utilized when there is no central decision-making authority. This is typically seen in situations where many company acquisitions have taken place, but the companies that are being acquired still need to operate as independent business units. So with this approach, there is no central point for decisions. The decision-making authority rests within each unit. So here, if I use my cab example again, I would have multiple cabs, but each cab operates independently on its own, doesn't work with any of the other cabs. That then assumes that the things that the local cab needs to look at will always only be changes that impact that local business unit. The other business units don't really care or are not impacted by any changes made to that from one unit to another. So the positive side to this is this works where a single model can't be applied. It might be good for global or emerging companies, again, where the subunits are very independent and don't need to work together well. Provides management efficiency at local sites. On the downside, expect you're going to have redundancies in solutions. So each subunit will implement whatever solution on their own in different ways, and it's quite possible that if you were to step back and look at all the subunits together, you would see that each subunit may be doing the similar kinds of things with in their own different manner. It's the most expensive in terms of implementing because, again, each subunit may buy their own tools, may utilize their own processes, their own staffing to run the processes. And expect that you'll see replication and variation in processes across the subunits as you go forward. So again, you don't see this model used too much, but again, it's the business driver of having independence across the units that most likely will drive use of this kind of a workgroup approach. So what best practices or good practices for organization solutions exist when you want to manage your IT service management solutions? What do you do if you look around at your current organization and it is heavily siloed by technology? Maybe you've got a server group, a mainframe group, a network group, a service desk, and they're all operating independently. How do you get started on making all these groups work together? Here's a general approach which has worked reasonably well. The recommendation is that you create yet one more silo as a peer group that logically will work across the other peer groups. Ideally, this group should report directly to the same levels that those groups also report to. This group will act as an independent quality arm to assure that the processes and solutions that are being implemented and operated are operated appropriately. This is the group where you might put your idle roles such as service manager or process manager or process owner, but this group will be responsible for actually implementing and owning all the idle solutions. What they're doing then is embedding them and working across all the other silos that may exist in your organization today to make this operate. If idle roles are placed within those groups versus outside them, in other words, if you decide that you don't want to use this approach, but you're going to take, let's say, somebody out of your server group or maybe somebody out of your network group and just make them do idle, there is a very high risk for failure in doing that. Typically because those people will not have the authority and even the job responsibility or even being rewarded to do so to make their solutions work across the other silos. The goals of IT service management, remember, are to operate by service, not by technology. If you start to implement idle by technology, then your idle goals are really not being realized and you're losing a lot of the benefits of doing this in the first place. On the opposite side, if you attempt to radically change your IT organization by service, in other words, we're going to re-swizzle the entire organization around to be a service organization, you may run into other problems. That approach may be considered too radical for most IT organizations. Typically, some companies that have tried that have seen a lot of confusion and chaos that then results. So this peer approach of adding yet one more silo, call it your IT service management silo, putting all your IT service management solution people in that, and then having that report logically across the rest of your silos as they exist today, generally is used by a number of companies fairly successfully, and I would say that's a very good recommended approach if you're trying to initially get out of your silos. Over time, you can decide to make more radical organization changes, but by then you'll be doing that having known that the solutions you're working with actually are now working. Here's a view for some good practices in looking at IT organizations in general. Your organization may look fairly complex, but at a minimum, when you look at that organization, there should be generally 3 lines of responsibility that could be derived out of it. One is something called a service management path or communication path. The other is called a service design transition path, and then a service operation path. For purists, your ICT functions underpin all 3 paths. In analyzing the operations of many data centers, these 3 general paths should be gleaned from the organization structure. I have found that in places where you can't, that's typically an IT organization that's having many, many problems, a lot of finger pointing, or maybe things are just not getting done or missed. The service management path, think of it this way, it is the path or line of people or operations that interfaces with your customers. Examples of people or functions in here can include things like service owners, process owners, business liaisons. I would halfway argue that your service desk should be here because they also interface with customers. But think of that line under service management as as kind of like a customer-facing type of path. The service design transition path is around the group of people that design, build, and transition new service solutions. So these are the people that work on projects. They basically build and engineer and get things new into place. Your service operation path is just worried with operating those solutions on a day-to-day basis. So let's take a look at these in just a little more detail. So here's that service management function. Again, this is the outer-facing roles and responsibilities that face outward from IT. Think of this group as the face of IT to the rest of the business and other business units. Again, examples of things that can go in here include your service desk, your business liaisons, billing functions, really anything that has to do with anything that's customer-facing would go under this particular. The design transition path generally contains those roles and functions that provision and troubleshoot and design and build services. This example basically shows, you'll see here, a lot of the idle service design and service transition processes are typically represented within this path and executed within this path. There are also some additional areas added to this that are related to building your services in terms of designing hardware, implementing hardware, and software as well. In general, this path builds based on requirements that come out of that service communications path or service management path that we saw earlier. Again, think of this group as they're the group that will engineer, build, and enhance items and things that go into production. The service operations path, again, is responsible for operating services day to day. Again, you will see a lot of the idle service operations processes represented here, along with many other types of typical functions that you might find in a large-scale data center. But the main role of the people in this particular path are to operate the solutions on a day-to-day basis and manage those successfully. So how do you define and build the appropriate organization? Here's an approach that you might utilize. It consists of 7 steps that start with defining your roles and end with assigning and placing staff and resources into each of these roles. The steps are: inventory your roles, identify the tasks by each role, skills and skill levels, map those roles into an organization structure, map the roles into job descriptions, and then assign staff to those job descriptions, and then lastly, communicate and train staff to those roles. To show this much more easily, we'll use a spreadsheet example that carries you through one step at a time. The first step is to inventory the roles you will need to operate your IT service management solutions once they are put into place. Again, the Implementing ITIL book provides detailed lists and descriptions of recommended roles for operating IT service management. The Architecting ITIL book also provides these as well. You may also have already determined what your roles are when you went through the IT service management design work stage. So now here on this spreadsheet, the first step will be to just simply list these roles, one in each row, as we've shown in this example. Once you have your list of roles, now let's describe them in more detail and identify key activities and tasks for them. Again, the Implementing ITIL book and Architecting ITIL book will be helpful to provide these for you. And again, you may have already done these when you initially went through your design work stage. But here from a spreadsheet example, all we've done is added another column called description, and we've put each of those activities that belong to a role in each row that corresponds to the process, or that corresponds to the role column. Now we need to identify the skills and the level of skills needed for each role that we've defined. So in step 3, we're going to add these in. Skills are traits that are required for working within that role. Examples include things like having good technical ability, leadership skills, writing skills. Skills can be generic, like those, or they may be very specific, such as I need a certain tooling skill, or maybe a skill in a particular method or methodology. Skill levels identify the degree to which each skill trait is needed. So in the example above, you can see that we've rated skills 1 through 5. A 1 means just basic awareness is needed, not much of the skill other than just knowing that it's somewhat out there. A 5 means that an expert level is needed. Other ratings, such as a 3, might indicate a moderate level but be able to work independently. A 2 might be moderate level but still needs supervision when working. A 4 might mean they can lead and teach others in the skill. Again, how you define these is really up to you, but this example is just presented here. Notice how we've linked the skill level to the type of skill that's needed and then linked those skills back to the descriptions simply by adding 2 more columns to our example here, in our spreadsheet example. This information, by the way, can be used by your company human resources to help them identify appropriate candidates, especially if you're eventually going to go out hiring and trying to fill skill gaps that need to be overcome to appropriately handle the role. When you go through efforts like we're showing here, I guarantee that people in your human resources department will be pleasantly surprised when you come to the table with all this background information in terms of what you're truly looking for. In this step, we will map our roles into our organization structure. This implies that we already have an organization structure solution. So this might work against your existing organization as it is today with no changes, or maybe you've applied some of the concepts that we discussed earlier in this learning module in the previous lesson to build a future state organization that you're going to be working with. Either way, you create your organization structure, put that on the table, and then start to map the roles into that organization. So with a view, let's take your current organization structure just as an example. You can put roles or map them into your structure in one of three ways. One way is you can add the role to your existing organization entity. Another is you can create a new organization entity that will now own the role. A third way is that you can create a new organization reporting structure that will contain the role. So these are different ways that you can add roles or put roles into your existing structure as needed. In step 5, we will then need to map the roles into job descriptions. Remember that a role is not equal to a job. Your company may have very vague job descriptions like computer analyst 3 or manager level 1 or who knows what you may actually have there. But what we're doing here is mapping the roles that we've defined in the organization entity into actual job descriptions as your company has these today. The way you can do this can vary. One role can belong to one job. One role may be part of many job descriptions, or you may decide to collapse many roles into a single job descriptions. Or you may simply decide that I'm going to create new job descriptions for new roles that you're also creating. Again, when you do this part of the effort, you may need to work closely with your human resources department, as ultimately they're the ones that own the job descriptions, and typically those are also tied to benefits and salaries and other things. So for that reason, they need to be involved as you do this part of your analysis. In this step, we will now identify and assign staffing resources to the job descriptions that now have your desired roles in them. Again, you have several choices here as well. You can use existing staff and roles to their responsibilities. You can hire a new staff that will now own some of these roles, or you can transfer staff into the organization that will be executing your IT service management activities. But here again, you can see how we've now tied back people to job descriptions, back to skills and skill levels, back to roles, back to the roles which will then map into the processes that we work with. The last step is to train and prepare staffing resources to take on the roles. This is really where the bulk of your organizational change activities are going to start to happen. This is where everything hits the road. People that are now being assigned as a process owner or a CAB member or an incident manager, whatever those roles are, they have now seen a list of what their activities are. They know where in the organization everything fits, but they may not necessarily have all the skills and the understanding yet of what they need to have in order to execute on those roles. So there's a communication strategy that needs to occur to help bring these people on board and make sure they fully understand their job functions and are fully prepared to carry those forward. This is what the next lesson will now cover. Lesson 3. Embedding processes into the IT organization. Here is where the bulk of your work will take place. Getting the organization to successfully accept and adopt IT service management solutions is no easy task. Again, experience from many managers that have already worked with implementing ITIL solutions typically results in them finding that about 80% or more of their labor for their efforts on their entire project team is related to organizational change types of activities. So let's examine some tactics that can be used to help you in your own efforts. Processes would be easy to implement if we didn't have to work with people. Therefore, a focus program or organizational change is critical to make sure people will use the process and not resist or revert back to old ways. This is really the main goal of having the organizational change team as part of your implementation program. Typically, I include this team as part of the organization track. That team will bring the process from a piece of paper into the heads, hearts, and minds of the stakeholders that will be using your new ITIL solutions. It is the lack of attention to organizational change methods that is really the #1 reason why many ITIL implementations initially fail. The effort to make this change will involve training, workshops, all kinds of communication events, simulation exercises, including your stakeholders during testing, little communication events such as lunch and learns, maybe a newsletter within your organization. All of these things need to be designed, strategized, and put into place as part of your implementation efforts. In short, anything that communicates to people what is going on over and over is what is very important and should keep moving forward. To get started on an organizational change effort, you need to start with a solid communication strategy. Here is a checklist of items to consider in your strategy for effecting new process changes. This checklist should be reviewed and any gaps found addressed as much as possible before actually attempting to implement those changes. The underlined items represent very key things that need to be in place in order to ensure that successful change will happen. First, there needs to be a sense of urgency. People need to feel that there is truly a sound reason why this effort needs to go forward and that it can't wait, it cannot be delayed. You need to have visible and committed leadership. The leaders of your organization not only need to fund this effort, but they need to be visibly seen walking the talk. They need to be in front of people, maybe it's even only a few minutes at the start of some key meetings, but people need to see the leadership as a committed group of people as well. There needs to be clarity of direction. People need to see the path that you are going down and feel that there's a way to get from point A to point B. If they're going to be changing how they do a particular process, they need to understand in very clear terms how they're doing things today and how those things will start to change as they transition to the new effort. As you go through your campaign, you need to have measurable goals. The goals of each campaign in your strategy need to be very specific and make sure that nothing is very unambiguous. Disciplined project management. As you go through this effort, project management skills will be needed to help carry out many of these communication activities to plan, build, and execute on them. Broad-based participation, and again, our concept of utilizing that core team, extended team, and advisor team strategy really helps in this area. But by broad-based participation, making sure that all stakeholders impacted in your new solutions are engaged very early on in the process. Having a single program focus is also important. Making sure that there's alignment and coordination among efforts, that there's very clear management approaches, such as having a program office that will stand as the single point of coordination for doing this, and that your teams are skilled and the decision-making processes are in place to quickly and efficiently make decisions as needed over time. And then lastly, targeted and effective communications are very key. Communications and feedback from your stakeholder are going to be extremely important in this effort. You need to make sure that your stakeholders are on board, that they accept the solution that's coming down the pike. This will take a number of communication events to communicate over and over and over and over until they finally begin to absorb and adopt many of the changes that you're putting in place. Don't forget to keep addressing their concerns and always be thinking that they will be thinking, what's in it for me, as they keep learning and understanding more about where you're going. This is truly about changing behaviors, hearts, and minds of the people that you'll be working with. This is a lot different than a typical IT software project where you're installing software. When you install software, the machines and the platforms and the operating systems that you put that software on typically do not resist your efforts that you're undergoing. In addition, you can see the results very clearly. Software is either installed on a server and working correctly, or it is not working correctly. So it's very simple to see the results of a day's work in IT by seeing what's been installed and what's running and working. When you're changing the behavior of people, it's not quite so clear. In addition, people will naturally reject change. This is programmed into us by nature. I'm thoroughly convinced that 99.9% of everybody you work with within your own IT organization truly wants everyone to be successful and do a good job. But they have their own priorities and their own activities and their own areas of concern that they're each individually working with every day. So anything new that comes into that, they will naturally reject. Remember the example I used earlier on in a earlier learning module. What might happen if I were to just simply design a new process solution on my own, walk into your organization, and then tell everybody they have to use it starting Monday morning? Most people will reject that kind of a situation. So you need to help ease them into this and prepare them for that over some period of time. Just about everyone goes through several behavioral states before they adopt new behaviors. The above slide shows what these states are and where some of the pitfalls lie. For example, a stakeholder may fully understand a new process solution, but have a negative perception about it. They may have a positive perception about the process, but maybe encounter a bad experience with it that might threaten the acceptance. All of these risks and the way that people transition to final acceptance really need to be understood and planned for within the training and communications that will take place as you roll out your new process solutions. Think of your communication efforts as having communication campaigns, just like an ad campaign might be used in normal commercial industry. Different behavior states towards acceptance can be dealt with by building a communication strategy and plan. The above shows a typical representative campaign. It starts out with awareness and understanding, making sure people are just aware of what's going on and then making sure that they understand where things are going. Then the next campaign may focus on further understanding and make sure that people start to have a positive perception in terms of what's going to change. Your pilot is one form of communication campaign, as people start to see how the new process solution works and what some of the benefits might be. Rollout will be also involve lots of communication, and then eventual follow-up after you've implemented to make sure that people are comfortable with the changes that have taken place, and most importantly, that they don't start to slip back towards some of the old behaviors and ways of doing things. Notice that each campaign is plotted out over time. For example, activities to be done in the Understanding and Positive Perceptions campaign will occur from the middle of month 1 to the middle of month 3. Once you've laid your campaign out, you simply treat this as a project plan, monitoring it for its key milestones and making sure along the way that each area has been covered before you proceed to the next. Every campaign that you set out to do should have its own measurable objectives. It is very important to define for each campaign what is success. Make sure that you can do that, not only identifying the success factors, but also the measurements that will guarantee that that success has truly been achieved. The above slide shows some examples of some metrics that might be used for various campaigns. Notice the Awareness and Understanding campaign. Here a metric has been set that 100% of directly impacted personnel will be aware of the new incident management process. The majority of directors and managers will be able to explain the new incident management process and its objectives in their own words. These are just examples of certain kinds of recognizable milestones, if you will, that you can test for and measure and monitor to make sure that as you execute each campaign, that you're actually and truly being successful with it. Each campaign that you run should select the best communication channels for getting the messages across. This slide presents some examples of what those communication channels might be. Email is an example of one, voicemail, a newsletter, a memo or letter from a key executive, presentations and staff meetings, maybe a voicemail box with an ask your question, or maybe just some management scripts that managers use at their own internal meetings when they're addressing their local staff. The above example shows how each campaign will use each communications channel that's available to it. Note that the columns list each campaign that's going to be part of the communications strategy. Where you see the check marks indicates the kind of vehicle or communication channel that campaign will use to get its messages across and test for the goals that the communications campaign is running successfully. Here are some more channel examples. We have the intranet, across the intranet, having portals that people may see. If you have a company intranet, you may have messages about your efforts shown on there. One-on-one talks between managers and staff, maybe a day-in-the-life video that everybody sees. Training sessions are certainly part of your communications plan. Mentoring and coaching, rewards and recognition, and performance reviews. Again, we've listed these here just to try to give you a very good sampling of the kinds of communication channels you might use as you execute your own campaigns. Note that increasing managerial and administrative channels become more prominent in the later campaign stages. Along with identifying those communication channels for each campaign, you also need to identify who your target audience is for each campaign, what kind of requirements you'll need to fulfill with them, and then also what kinds of messages you want to get across. Identifying your target audience, especially the requirements, really helps you to hone your messages and identify groups of common requirements. This also prevents mixed messages from going out across the organization. It helps squelch rumors or innuendo or other things that may occur as people are trying to figure out and understand what your new solutions will actually entail. This provides a semblance of order and structure in your communications when you plan things in this way. Identification of your target audience groups should be part of the communications plan and segregated by each communications campaign. In our example on this slide, you can see that we've identified in one column who our audience is going to be. In these examples, we've got executives as one type of customer and managers and supervisors as another. For each one of these target audiences, we've then addressed some general requirements. For example, the executives might need an overview of the new process at a very high level, and more importantly, they need to know why the process is being changed, what its goals are, and when things will be changed. In the specific information requirements, we may identify those things that we want to make sure that the executives are seeing and listening to. What kinds of relationships or impact other corporate initiatives that are there. Process priorities, process leadership and staffing. Some examples of those. Again, and you'll see I tend to be a fan of spreadsheets here. But a spreadsheet or something similar to that is certainly an appropriate vehicle for putting your strategy together. Here you can see in the columns we've identified the channel that we're going to use, the target dates for when certain kinds of events might occur. In the messages column, we have a cross-reference to the kinds of messages that we want to happen, and then the audience, who's going to be the recipient of all these messages and by what channel they're going to receive these on. Note that the spreadsheet here represents only one campaign. So in essence, you will develop maybe a separate spreadsheet for each separate campaign that you intend to deliver. Messages need to be carefully crafted and formalized, and then make sure, again, as this shows, that the messages are sharply determined, your target dates for delivering them, and your audiences are truly established. As we close on this, one last several set of things to consider. Again, repetition is absolutely key to your success. Don't assume that because you've communicated something once that people have absorbed it and truly understand it. The more times that people hear about something, over time, the more use they will be to it as it really starts to materialize. Also remember to be open to concerns. Don't let people feel that they're being forced into something different unless it's for a very good reason. Again, always think that they will be thinking, what's in this for me? And try to address that to the greatest extent possible. Don't try to avoid all the labor involved with doing communication types of efforts that we've just presented with what I call the dictator approach. And I've seen some people at the senior executive levels, unfortunately, that feel they can shortcut this effort by simply just making people do something and then maybe firing a few people to just demonstrate that they're serious about it. That kind of an approach almost always fails. I've never seen that work successfully. In addition, it creates worse resistance because, again, now people are being forced to do something that they truly haven't had time to adopt and accept. As a marker, I've seen some actual IT organizations that have undergone this, where the senior executives and management truly were on board for an ITIL solution and wanted to see it go forward. But because they couldn't get the IT staff to accept what they were doing and where the changes were coming from, the IT staff strongly resisted and the entire effort failed. So while a lot of people feel it's important to get senior management on board, and certainly it is, there are also similar cases where if you don't get the IT staff on board, you could still fail, even though management wants things to happen. And then as a last consideration, make sure that you bring people along. Don't try to inundate them with too many messages at once. Always keep it simple, keep it clear, and introduce concepts over time to help them prepare for the coming changes. As an example, if you're implementing a new process, introduce them first, probably to the fact that you're going to be changing the process and why. And then as time goes on, start to introduce them first to some of the basic concepts, then to some of the more complex concepts that might be involved with your process, then on to maybe training and trying out your process, and then eventually into maybe learning a new tool or other things with that. But plan that out over time. Bring people along. Don't just put them in a room and try to cover everything all at once. It will just simply be too much information for them to absorb. And if people can't absorb everything, again, they will tend to be resistant. So hopefully some of these things have been helpful. And again, the attention and care paid to really managing your messages and doing a proper communication strategy, again, is very key to your success as you go forward. Lesson 4, IT Service Management Metrics, Validating the Results. A process solution is not a process solution unless it is measured. What cannot be seen cannot be managed, improved, or changed. For some reason, IT traditionally resists metrics. It's typically done to respond to management requests. Typically, it's management that asks for numbers. IT doesn't typically come up with these on their own. Not that every organization reacts that way, but if you were to take a look at many, many different IT organizations, you would probably see that that's a typical trend in most places. In addition, once IT tries to put metrics in place and communicate those to management, they typically communicate many operational items of little meaning to upper management. You have to remember that the key concern of executives at the top is to try to get that transparency and the ability to make necessary decisions. Many times, they are being forced to react to events as they occur. Might be a system outage, maybe it's some form of major IT issue, or maybe it's just a simple failure. But this puts them in a very uncomfortable position with the rest of the business. In short, as you look at your metrics, you truly will not know if you are successful without measuring what you are producing. So it is very important to make sure that metrics are included along the way, from the very first time that you start to put your strategy together, to design, to transition, and eventually into operations on an ongoing basis. So let's take just a brief look at IT service management metrics. Again, the installation of these will be very critical to your success in your ITIL implementation effort. Here is the 7-step continual service improvement process is described in the EITL Continual Service Improvement book. Make sure when you look at this chart, notice what's in step 1. Do not skip this step. It is very common for IT people to start with step 2 by looking at their tool sets and their capabilities and saying, based on what we have installed today, here's the kinds of numbers we can produce. Try to avoid falling into that trap. Step 1 says define what you should measure, and that is where you should start. Then take a look at what you can measure, and then gather the data, process it, analyze it, present to management, and then determine and implement solutions based on the data that you pull together. In the instances, as we've seen before, if you cannot pull certain measurements or the tools and capabilities aren't there, always look for alternative measurements that you can use even on a temporary basis to still report on what is happening. Don't use the lack of capability to avoid reporting on measurements at all. Another thing is, don't forget that the EITL Continual Service Improvement book is very rich with all kinds of measurement approaches and techniques that can be used. Those of you that may have learned about Six Sigma or Lean Six Sigma will find many examples that look very similar to that kind of an approach all throughout the book. Again, operating without metrics truly leaves everyone blind to what is going on. This is a series of old sayings that people use when you don't have measurements. What you don't measure, you can't manage. What you don't measure, you can't improve. You also tend to communicate that if you're not measuring something, you probably really don't care about what you're doing or the quality of what you're delivering. And again, kind of on the opposite end, if you really can't influence something, then don't bother to keep taking measurements and reporting on it. So just some caveats to consider as you go forward. Again, remember the importance of having those metrics in place. Just a quick word on which metrics matter. Again, the Measuring EITL book gives you plenty of information and examples of the kinds of metrics you may want to consider that truly do matter to executives. But just to define, what's the difference between a metric that might be operational and what's a metric that we can use as a key performance indicator, or as I say, key KPIs are basically those metrics that matter, is shown on this slide. Here we're reporting on something with change management. We have one example of a metric at the top. We are just simply reporting on the number of changes that took place during the last month. This particular metric from a management perspective doesn't really matter because all it did was describe what took place and provided no information for any kinds of decisions or future action. If you send a metric like this up to senior executives, they will look at the 1,067 that's shown here, and they will scratch their heads and say, is this anything of importance? Does this mean something good? Is this something bad? Should we be making this number smaller, larger? They're really not going to understand why this number is being shown to them or what they need to do with it. The metric at the bottom, however, does present a metric that matters. And here what we're calling it is a change success rate. What we've done is we've taken two operational metrics, the number of changes that we've made, and another operational metric, the number of changes that went in successfully. And we're creating a ratio where we'll take the number of changes that went in successfully and divide it by the number of all the changes that were put into place. This basically tells us what % of our changes are actually being put in successfully. If I show this ratio to management, it's very simple for people to see that if the number is high, i.e. it's in the 90s as shown here, then that may be a fairly good thing. If the number were to be low, let's say 40% or some low number, management will look at that and say, you mean you're only successful 40% of the time? This can't possibly be good. Maybe we need to take some actions to improve how we handle changes. So in other words, senior executives can make decisions based on the metric and the number that's shown there. Note that this provides a quality indication, it's easily identifiable, and it tells management what actions need to occur for improvement. So when you're trying to put your own metrics in place, the key question to ask is ask yourself and put yourself in the shoes of your management and say, if I report this particular metric to them, what decision or actions do I want them to take as a result of the number that I'm putting in front of them? The above illustration in this slide presents an example of an IT service management metrics model that you can use for measuring the quality and success of your implemented processes. Much of the detail around what metrics you might use, how you might calculate these, how this model works, and approach for it are described in detail in the Measuring ITIL book. Shown below each part of the model is an example set of metrics and how these might carry through the model. Let's take a look at some of these. We start with the operational box. The operational box is really a set of metrics that simply describe historical actions or events that have taken place. So here we have a change management example, and we're saying here's where we might identify how many changes are in our pipeline, or how many changes did we successfully complete, or how many changes did we actually make. So again, just describing things that took place, historical events, are called operational metrics, and that's what would fall in this category. We then create KPIs. Again, these are the metrics that do matter, by combining operational metrics in some form or formula. And again, the Measuring ITIL book actually provides these for you in many different process examples. But here is the example we saw earlier with that change success rate or change efficiency. We can simply divide, in this example that was shown here, the number of changes successfully completed versus all the changes in our pipeline, and that might give us an efficiency ratio that tells us how efficient we are in implementing changes as we go forward. In other words, if the ratio were very low, that would indicate that we have a very large pipeline and we're not getting a lot of work really done. If the number is very high, then our pipeline is very efficient and we tend to implement changes within a reasonable time frame as we go forward. Pretty good metric in terms of seeing how things are actually operating and working. Now, along with that KPI, what are the benchmarks or areas in terms of how do you know that the number you're seeing is necessarily a good number or a bad number? You do this with something called tolerances. In the tolerance box, you'll see that there's a target benchmark and a warning benchmark. The target benchmark says 95%. This means that if that change efficiency KPI is at 95% or higher, then we are in the green zone. We are probably operating at an acceptable level or even better. If it's in between the 95 and the 85%, which is identified in the warning zone, then it might be in the yellow zone, as we might say. In other words, meaning if the metric falls within that range, that might be a warning flag to say maybe we better watch this a little closer, or maybe we may want to think about what we might do in terms of if it starts to get worse. And then lastly, if the metric were to fall below the warning level, let's say it was at 84% or less, that would be in the red zone, and will be a red flag to indicate that a decision must be made, and that decision may be to take some action to try to increase that level to make it more efficient. As we move forward in the model, you notice that the KPIs link to CSFs, or critical success factors. Critical success factors are statements of what has to be done at a high level that indicates your process is being successful. One example that is shown here is that we need to implement changes efficiently. How do we know we're really implementing changes efficiently? Well, our KPI is linked into that. And the way we'll know that is if that KPI in that example we have falls below that warning tolerance of 85%. So our critical success factor will be put at jeopardy if the KPI falls within that range. Critical success factors also relate typically to outcomes. Outcomes are business events that might occur if a critical success factor is not met. So if I don't implement changes efficiently, I might be exposed to maybe possible legal problems. Maybe there's an outage that is continuing to occur. I might have security exposures that don't get addressed, or maybe I'm just simply not putting solutions in on time. Again, these are outcomes that are risks that occur if your critical success factor can't be met, and they're just simply listed. And then lastly, the dashboards represent some form of communication to upper management in terms of how will they see the results of your KPIs and critical success factors. The Measuring Idle book includes a simple spreadsheet dashboard that includes this model and all the things shown there. It allows management to quickly see how well their processes are working, whether things are in the green, yellow, or red zone, and whether actions need to occur, and what risks may be occurring to their potential business outcomes. So let's take a look at what some of this might look like. Here's a screenshot from the metrics modeling tool that's included with your book of materials. Again, this simple tool may be useful if you have absolutely nothing else to work with. There are vendor products that are available that certainly provide much more functionality and things that are much more cool to look at if you want to go down that route. This was provided just to give you something simple to start with, and then it's up to you how much more you want to add to this over time. This could be used as a reference for customizing what calculation and service reporting tools you might prefer. One of the nice things about this analysis spreadsheet is all the calculations and metrics and things to measure are already shown and included in there. You get a starter set of metrics and calculations, and again, you can use that as a base to start your own efforts and then add to that or use the items from that you feel are most valuable. The modeling tool will automatically calculate your KPI values and scores based on your operational metrics and tolerances. And again, we'll show colors, green, yellow, and red, that indicate whether things are working, not working, and whether you may want to consider some actions. The way this analysis tool works is if you look at the blue areas are where you enter your operational metrics. Along to the right-hand side of the blue area is some instructions or recommendations of where you might find that metric within your own IT infrastructure. What kinds of reporting tools typically give you those kinds of metrics. So those things will be populated manually by yourself, filling in the blue areas, and then the rest of the spreadsheet below the tolerance levels is automatically calculated based on all your inputs. Notice in the tolerance levels you just simply enter what's your target level, what's the benchmark level for the target, and what's your benchmark level for warning. So the spreadsheet will calculate your operational metrics, compare them to your target and warning levels, and then indicate with a red, green, or yellow whether you're performing well or not performing well. Towards the bottom of the spreadsheet, you'll also see kind of a mini dashboard specific to your process. In that mini dashboard, we kind of used a balanced scorecard approach: customer, capability, operational, financial, and regulatory, and also color-coded those based on the critical success factors. The way the sheet works is that your critical success factors are linked back to your KPIs, and then this particular dashboard combines all your critical success factors, identifies whether they fall in one of these balanced scorecard areas, and then just simply adds up your red, greens, and yellows and gives you kind of a higher level look at how well things are working. The other interesting thing is that below the balanced scorecard types of boxes, you see a number of outcomes that are listed there. Examples again: legal exposure, service outages, rework, delayed solutions, slow operational processes, maybe security breaches. Here is a list of all the potential outcomes, the negative outcomes that could occur. As your scores are calculated, the likelihood of these risks occurring is then shown in the boxes that you see to the left-hand side of each one. So one of the things you see in this example under service outages, you see that there's a high likelihood that service outages could occur based on the scores that you're getting right now. You also, if you go down farther on the outcomes, you see under security breaches, there's also a high possibility that those will occur as well. If you're doing a change management process and you're using this particular spreadsheet to measure and monitor your process to see how well it's working, try putting in a high level of unauthorized changes. These are changes that people put in and didn't use the process. You will see these negative outcomes all light up red. It's an example I use when communicating a new change management process to IT staff, just to highlight what they're exposing their own organization to when they put changes in without going through a proper change analysis approach. Again, just a little hint or technique you might consider if you're trying to get people on board. But again, that's a good example, by the way, that also shows how you can pictorially represent what's actually going on and using metrics to help drive people's behavior and make things noticeable to them about what's going on in your IT infrastructure. We have now covered all of the ITIL implementation lifecycle and its activities as presented in this course. As a last step, at the very end, make sure that you identify and inventory any future improvement recommendations and issues that you may have seen along the way. Note that in our example that we have shown above, we've inventoried what these issues are and we've segregated these into process, technology, organization, and governance categories. These will then become input into our next iteration of the ITIL implementation lifecycle, where we will then address additional issues and improvements to continually improve the quality of the IT services that we are delivering. Here we are presenting the ITIL Continual Service Improvement Model as shown in the ITIL Continual Service Improvement book. Our implementation approach was designed to specifically work with this, as you've seen on past illustrations of the approach where we have shown each of these steps or questions underneath each of the implementation lifecycle boxes that we have shown. We'll also see this one last time on the upcoming slide. This reinforces the fact that implementing ITIL, again, is really an ongoing program, not a one-time project. Note the questions that are listed in the model. Again, this starts out with what is our vision, goes on to where are we now today, comparing back to that vision, identifying gaps. Then we say where do we want to be, so we take a look at those gaps and say which gaps do we really want to mitigate, what improvements do we truly want to make. Then we go on to how do we get to where we want to be. That's where we're doing our planning and identifying the kinds of activities and steps that will take place to overcome those gaps. And then in between this one and the next question about milestones, I always call that, and then a miracle occurs, but that's really where your implementation effort is occurring. And then when we're completed with that, we ask and say, have our milestones truly been achieved? And that's where we circle back and we say, how do we keep the momentum going? We keep it going by looking at some of the issues that we discovered along the way, what improvements may need to still be made that we weren't able to address the first time, and then ramp right back up to the top with the vision again. So again, this just reinforces the fact that this will be an ongoing effort over time. It's not just a one-time project as you keep that happens once. Hopefully, the series of learning modules has been helpful. The general workflow, from visioning to assessment to planning to design and transition, with a parallel effort for looking at short-term or initial wins. This, by the way, mirrors a long-time approach often used for implementing process changes within business organizations. There is no rocket science here. An approach like this, and while these may vary in minor ways from one way versus another, this particular kind of approach has been used literally for decades with other kinds of things outside of ITIL. The Implementing ITIL and Measuring ITIL, Servicing ITIL, and Architecting ITIL books will give you much more detail around the tasks and activities involved with an ITIL implementation effort. The materials that come with the course provide a wealth of knowledge, experience, examples of all kinds of artifacts and techniques and maybe little analysis tools that you can use along the way. Feel free to use these as ongoing reference guides for the activities you're planning to undertake around your own ITIL implementation efforts.